Daikaiju Network's Daikaiju Fest 2021. In this segment, we are going to be covering the 1962 version of King Kong vs. Godzilla, the Japanese cut. I am your host, Kent. Jason is not going to be joining us for this particular one because he does not have the version of the film that I'm going to be commentating on. So, the version of the film that I'm going to be using should be pretty obvious, I think, to a lot of people. It's going to be the one from the Criterion collection because, for the most part, anybody who's going to have it is going to have that. And I kind of figure in terms of synchronizing and all that, it's going to work better if I use this one than my DVD copy that I've had for a little over a decade now, but we're not going to get into that. So all of you lovely people out there are stuck with me for about the next hour and 40-ish more minutes as we go through the Japanese cut of this classic film. It's sort of a continuation of what we did back in March to celebrate the upcoming, or then upcoming, Godzilla vs. Kong film. And I just kind of figured, you know what, we did the American edit of that film. Why not do the Japanese version? So here, I'm going to turn off the camera here in just a moment, put up a nice fancy graphic, and we will do the countdown to get ready to commentate on the film, and we will get going. So we'll see you in just a moment. Okay, so here we are. I have the menu queued up on Disc 8, which is the special features in which this film resides in. I have everything selected on play. And so anybody who is not familiar with how we do commentaries here, I count down from 3. I go 3, 2, 1, go. And when I say go, that's when we hit OK on our remotes. So here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. A Toho 30th anniversary film. There's a lot to say about this particular film. It's kind of difficult to know where to start. And seeing the Toho scope here, I just figure I might as well just go into some general trivia or tidbits about this particular film to begin with. With the Toho scope coming up, or having already shown itself, this was the first Godzilla film to be shot in widescreen, or Toho scope as it's called here. It's their version of CinemaScope and widescreen. It's also the first Godzilla movie to be presented in color. It's also the first Godzilla movie to use stereophonic sound. And it's also the first and only Godzilla movie, really, that is technically a comedy. Now, to kind of go from here, I could go in any sort of different direction here, and because there's so many interesting tidbits about this film, its production, and kind of how it came to the States and got heavily edited. I think maybe the next best thing to do would be to talk about sort of the origins of this film. And so we'll just start off there. Willis O'Brien, you might remember him for the special effects of 1925's A Lost World and 1933's King Kong, a film and a character that helped to heavily inspire Godzilla. So Godzilla is meeting his maker, in a sense, I guess you could say, in this film. Willis O'Brien had kind of a rough professional career. He, even though he was sort of involved, well, not sort of, he was involved in 2 of the most popular science fiction films of all time, in The Lost World and 1933's King Kong. He just had a kind of a troubled professional career where certain projects would either begin and then fall by the wayside, either due to expenses and how stop motion was, how much it would cost the studios. And he would also write some treatments for other films, and similar to his work when he was hired as a special effects director, some of them would start and then get cut because they realized again how expensive it would be to do the effects for the film, or for just no apparent reason whatsoever, they never went through. So he ended up doing a treatment or for a sequel to King Kong, and it was under several different titles, at least according to different sources. Um, I don't know if O'Brien himself labeled the film all three of these at one point or just one, but the one I tend to see the most is King Kong versus Prometheus. And the other two titles are King Kong versus the Ginkgo and King Kong versus Frankenstein. The general premise of that story is that you have a Frankenstein type of creature that is made up of different African animal body parts, and uh, Carl Denham ends up capturing Kong once again, but I believe in the treatment he also brings this Frankensteinian type of creature as well to the United States, and more specifically San Francisco. The two creatures get out, of course, and then they end up battling on the Golden Gate Bridge, where they, in pretty boring fashion, tumble into the bay. And that is the end of that story. Um, he tried selling it to several different studios. Nobody would take it. He ended up going to John Beck, and John Beck ended up buying the story treatment from him. And that was kind of it in terms of O'Brien's part. Sadly, O'Brien never heard from Beck again, and more or less, I think, I don't want to say he was bitter, but he was very heartbroken about not just how successful that this particular film became, but also just because, again, his whole professional career was really just kind of a roller coaster of success and disappointments. But John Beck ended up trying to shopping the treatment of this film around to different places in the United States. Again, no studio wanted it. So then he went around to different countries across the globe, including Italy. No one else wanted it. And then he ended up at Toho, where Toho indeed was saying, sure, we will take it, but instead of the Frankenstein's monster, we will do Godzilla, because we want King Kong. King Kong, at the time that this film was being produced, was obviously the most popular of the two kaiju, and King Kong, of course, being one of the fathers, if not maybe arguably the founding father of the Godzilla character. And Toho was having their 30th anniversary as a studio in 1962, and they decided this is one of the best ways to celebrate their studio. Not only to have the King Kong license and to produce a King Kong film, but to revive their Godzilla character, who at this point was on hiatus for about, 7 years at this point. So you have the Clash of the Titans, and it can be probably argued that this particular film, at least for Western audiences, helped put Godzilla more on the map and helped his popularity grow quite a bit. Going back to O'Brien for just a moment, um, bef- kind of before his passing in 1993, it appeared that there was going to be a lawsuit. Against who, no one really knows, but it is presumed that it was going to be against John Beck um, for, taking the most credit for this film and getting it produced. And regardless, anyways, the lawsuit, whoever it was against, was dropped, and it was mainly due to lawyer fees. Initially, when Honda was tasked to direct this film, Honda, of course, wanted to continue the trend of making Godzilla more of a darker, serious character. Um, However, the Salaryman comedies, which were very popular for Toho around this time, um, Toho sort of decided that for their 30th anniversary film, and for the fact that that genre of films was so popular for them and profitable, Toho decided, no, we're going to go more the comedy slash family route. And while Honda was disappointed in the direction that this film took in terms of its tone, he more or less kind of shrugged his shoulders and, went along. He was a company man and he figured, what else can I do? This is the studio's film. So he sort of changed his approach to the film. Instead of trying to produce the movie that he wanted to, because he couldn't, obviously, he just decided, hey, I'm just going to try to make the most enjoyable, entertaining film that I can here. And as we approach the scene here inside Sakurai's apartment, and here we just saw a quick jump in the quality of the film. When we initially got into Sakurai's apartment, we saw the quality of the film degrade maybe a couple of steps. And then we saw it improve as he was making his way towards his sister's apartment here. This particular version of the film that we got, not just on the Criterion Collection, but overall in Japan, is a patched up work film. The original cut of this film, it really has either been lost or maybe it was accidentally destroyed or something. No one really seems to know what happened to it. But the only Japanese version of this film that survives is this patched up film. It is a combination of the 1970s Champion Film Festival edition, which was a version of the film that was cut down to about 74 minutes, and another version of the film, and they were edited together. Toho worked meticulously to try to obviously make sure that everything lined up. The thing is, though, if that film was another copy, wasn't it the original? It sort of kind of doesn't make sense in a way. But nevertheless, the Champion Festival film is the one that is in the best shape here. And the other film that they used to edit the missing pieces together was a film that was in pretty poor shape. Kind of in the late 80s when Toho released this movie in Japan on home video, it was in really rough shape in those non-Champion Festival parts, and a lot of people complained about it. And then what they ended up doing in the early 90s, when the film was re-released again on Laserdisc and VHS, Toho really went through the telecine process where they really did the best they could to clean it up and to try to get the quality of the film higher and to match better. But unfortunately, you still see some of these scenes, and there's only so much you can do in terms of film restoration before you just kind of have to throw your hands up in the air and say, we did the best we could. It's kind of interesting watching this film with the American scene here. You have these American actors have totally different voices than they do in the Universal film. I find that funny because in the Universal film, which a majority of Godzilla fans have seen, these American actors sound more gruff and tough in their voices than they do here. And it's sort of, you know, I guess a dick measuring contest, for lack of a better word, kind of saying, hey, we want our guys to sound, like the tough Americans. And they they redubbed, I think, virtually every actor in that scene. There may have been maybe one actor in that scene in which they didn't dub over, but otherwise I think everybody else was dubbed over, and it's just it's so funny how uh, just how petulant that some of these Americans can be in terms of their representation of who they are, even for their home audiences, in which the Universal cut obviously was made for. Well, I did mention earlier that this film is the first and only official Godzilla comedy in terms of a film. I can hear some people out there saying, well, what about the films from the 70s and the late 60s? Well, those films were primarily aimed at children, and as a result, were kids' films first. With kids' films, yeah, some of the goofy charm and humor that comes with kids' entertainment will be a part of that, but they weren't played specifically as comedies. Here, this film is primarily played for as a comedy. You have a number of actors involved in this film. Ichiro Arimasa, if I remember that last name correctly, of Taro Takashima. And then you also have, I forget the other actor's name. Those actors were primarily players in those Salaryman films during the 50s and the 60s, and that is why they are here. As of course, with it being a Honda film, he tends to, in most of his movies, put in some themes, undertones of certain types of commentary he wishes to bring forth to his audiences. It's I don't want to say it's subtle. It is, I guess, because of the tone of the film, it is sort of a satire commentary mixed with sort of your generic hero slash monster film narrative. In that Mr. Taco uh, is this greedy corporatist who is trying to save a specific pharmaceuticals by capturing King Kong at the expense of the country, Japan. And it's a commentary on that. Basically, Japan by this point was starting to experience huge growth in their economy. And we get big roar from Godzilla here as he's burning the submarine Seahawk down here. Um, but Japan by this point was experiencing huge economic growth, or kind of the beginnings of that. And so commercialism was very much on the mind of Honda and other people during that time. And so that's what he wanted to commentate on. And so Mr. Taco is sort of the embodiment of the greedy corporatist who, I think, like many CEOs and other corporatists across the globe, and maybe even more specifically in this country, are willing to put their country in danger just so they can make as many profits as possible. With the film being geared more towards a family oriented audience and being more of a comedy, Eiji Tsuburaya decided to do the same with the monsters. Again, anyone who's even seen at least the American cut of this film knows that the kaiju, both Godzilla and Kong, are more anthropomorphic in their movements and their idiosyncrasies. And in fact, their movements and how they interact with one another is more like that of wrestling than that of a giant gorilla and a saurian dinosaur going at each other. They're very anthropomorphic, and wrestling was pretty popular in Japan at the time. And so, why not go ahead and do that? And in fact, in this particular edit of the film, it is mentioned a couple of times that these two kaiju are kind of like wrestlers, and you even get people placing bets in a couple of moments as well. And some of the individuals who worked under Eiji Tsuburaya during this filming were sort of shocked that he wanted the monsters to display certain idiosyncrasies that they thought were maybe too goofy and would delegitimize the the film in the eyes of the adults and maybe the Japanese film audience, because the previous two Godzilla movies were dark, grittier takes on the kaiju. The kaiju was an allegory for the H bombs and in general atomic weaponry, and they were sort of taken aback that this is the approach that they were going to take for this film. And in fact, more or less going forward, with maybe one or two exceptions, um, that's kind of how Godzilla is going to get treated throughout the rest of the Showa era, from 1954 through 1975 is the placement of that era. Going back for a moment to the greed of corporations and corporatists, um, quite a few people will say that Honda did an excellent job of displaying that in this film. I think he did it in a definitely a comedic sense, in terms of the buffoonish, aloof corporatist. It is, of course, again, a comedy, so there is sort of a comedy aspect to it as well, even though some real estate will end up getting damaged eventually. I felt like Honda in the following film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, did a superior job in bringing that message forth there than he does here. And I think for Mothra vs. Godzilla, he may have had a bit um, more of an independence that on that project than he had here. Because here Toho more or less was saying this is the kind of film you make. Uh, and I think Mothra vs. Godzilla, he had more say in how that film went, because corporate greed is more front and center, I would argue, in that film, and is more displayed in what I would argue a more realistic and cynical sense. That film is in no way, shape, or form funny. I mean, there are a couple of brief comedic moments, comic relief, but it's not like a King Kong vs. Godzilla where it is a comedy. Mothra vs. Godzilla is, in a sense, a science fiction drama, more or less. And I think Honda wanted to take the theme that he wanted to play out here and give it more exposure and to do the story more justice in a film that would allow him to write and to produce the story he wanted. And so now we're here on Faro Island, where Sakurai and his assistant here, I keep forgetting that character's name, are going to try to find a giant monster. And here we have a moment in the film in which a lot of fans take some issue with, and that is Japanese playing blackface. Um, Obviously, this was nothing really new in cinema across the globe during this time. You even go back to American cinema during this time and even before, you will occasionally see white people in blackface and all sorts of other just sort of insensitive representations. But at the time, obviously, even though it is wrong, that was how this was done at the time. Taro Takashima, who is by and large the leading man in this film, uh, he would end up appearing again in the Godzilla series in Son of Godzilla, and he would be the head professor on that expedition on Solgill Island. He also would make a cameo in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 in 1993. He had two sons that would go on to appear in Godzilla vs. Bylane, also in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and Godzilla vs. Destroya. The chief on Faro Island here, I don't know the actor's name, but if you've seen 1961's Mothra, he is the captain at the opening scene of that film. I think I just repeated myself there. That's the one thing about Blu-rays. If you don't, if you don't have like a home stereo system, the loud parts get really loud, and then when you come to the soft parts, you got to turn up your TV volume so you can hear it, and then, um, and then the loud parts come. You're always having to mess with your remote. There's Mihama in the green dress. She would go on to play in a couple of other kaiju films, including King Kong versus not obviously King Kong versus Godzilla, but King Kong Escapes. She would also be involved in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, which is one of my favorite Bond films. Kenji Sahara there off to the left. He's also a face that many kaiju fans would recognize. He's probably the most famous actor in the tokusatsu genre, probably only behind Akira Takarada. Kenji Sahara uh, made his tokusatsu film debut, at least in the kaiju subgenre, in Rodan in 1956. He would also be in The Mysterians. He would be in this film. He would be in the follow-up film Mothra vs. Godzilla. I'm probably not going to remember all the films he's involved here. He would also be involved in Son of Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters. Um, just quickly going, Godzilla's Revenge. And then I don't think he shows up again except for a quick cameo in 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. Then he won't show up again until the 90s films. I think he shows up in only 1994's Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, and then again he's not seen until Final Wars. These guys too were also redubbed in the Universal edit to also sound a bit more manly. When you look at the lip movement of those two actors, even for this Japanese edit, it seems like they were dubbed again for even this film because some of the words don't line up with their lips. I think some of the dialogue was different as they filmed it compared to what they ultimately wanted them to say. And here we really get a sense of Ifukubei's presence in this film with the Godzilla theme here. I really prefer the music being accompanied here in this scene. It definitely brings more a sense of menace to the whole scene. Whereas in the Universal edit, I don't believe any music is being played in this particular sequence. In the Universal edit of the film, everything but the Faro Islanders chant, all of Ifukubei's music is removed in that film, and a lot of stock Universal music was inserted in its place, and a lot of the music came from 1954's Creature from the Black Lagoon. When the film was being brought to the States and getting ready for distribution, John Beck uh, obviously wanted to Americanize it more for the audience. It's sort of unclear as to more specific motivations as to why he wanted to have it edited the way that it did. He hired Thomas Montgomery to do the editing of the film, and obviously that film really just lags. It's a very stilted film. It's a film that has a lot of issues with pace. It's a film that has a lot of issues with continuity, and um, just kind of dumb decisions being made. You have a handful of moments that are taking place in a United Nations newsroom with the character Eric Carter, who's sort of a Raymond Burr look-alike, and I don't know if that was intentional or not. But then eventually a character named Dr. Arnold Johnson comes in and brings in this bullshit pseudoscience to the film, in which he says dumb things like Godzilla is a cross between a T Rex and a Stegosaurus, and the reason why Godzilla and Kong are about to fight is because there's this, ongoing struggle between primates and reptiles, and these two are bound to meet and fight to the death. Godzilla's brain is the size of a marble, and Kong is a thinking animal, and just a bunch of bullshit. It's absolutely ridiculous. I will admit, though, I do have a bit of an affinity for that version because, well, it is the version of the film I grew up on. Um, this film obviously didn't become officially available until the States here until about, what is it, a year, almost a year ago now at this point. Um, Although, like I said, I've had a DVD copy for a little over a decade at this point. But I did grow up with the Universal edit of the film as a 8-year old when I first saw the film. Didn't mind it, but I wasn't as overly enthralled with it as I had hoped, but I thought it was still a rather entertaining film at the time. As I got older, of course, I realized it sort of was this stereotypical American type of film, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I have very much a soft spot for those types of films. But when I got older and realized that the film was really hacked up from the Japanese edit, I so badly wanted to know what all was missing from the film, and just sort of had assumptions as to what those missing pieces were, and felt like, man, here we get the news, and as you get older you get sophisticated and you begin to notice things a bit more. And I did start to notice, yeah, the news broadcasts from Eric Carter and all that, even though there's still a part of me that thinks that there's something a tad bit charming about those, they do take a lot away from the story here. They really insult and degrade the film. And it's sort of believed that John Beck made the cuts that he made because of one of two theories. Either he felt like American audiences not only needed to see white people in the film, but that the comedy or the satire would go over their head. And then there's also another theory, which I think is also maybe a tad bit more likely, in that he just never realized that this film was indeed a comedy or a satire. He didn't quite understand the comedic elements that Honda and Sekizawa incorporated into the story. American critics at the time, too, really despised this film. They despised it before it really was even done filming. It was, of course, believed that the whole suitimation process that Japan employed was considered inferior, and many people were offended by the fact that their beloved King Kong would go to a country in which he was going to be represented by a man in a suit. And um, apparently, there were a number of King Kong fans that skipped and ignored this film because they looked at it as an insult to their favorite giant ape. And then, even when the film was completed and eventually distributed here in the States, critics just lambasted it. And of course, too, they only saw the American cut, which, of course, is, when you really look at it, obviously a mess of a version of the film. Um, but who knows? Who knows if those critics would have changed their minds had they seen the Japanese edit of this film or not? Probably not. Here we have the famous octopus. It's a story that many people are very much aware of when they, have read about this film, and that when filming was completed for this poor octopus's scenes, Master Subaraya cooked and ate the poor thing. So animals were indeed harmed during the filming of this movie. It is sort of amazing, though, that they were able to get the octopus to do some of the things that they wanted it to do. I forget exactly some of the methods that they used, but I think even in a couple of moments they may have even used sort of a hair dryer on it to kind of get it to move in certain directions. I could be wrong about that. But Subaraya was always very um, interested in octopi. I think It Came from Beneath the Sea was one of the films that sort of got that interest in him going. And he was just fascinated by it. And of course, he works with an octopus here. He would work with some props in Ultra Q that would come a couple years later. He was always just fascinated by octopi and wanting to get them to work more on film. And as far as I'm aware of, I think this is the only time he's really worked with a live octopus. Of course, in one or two shots here, we do get a prop octopus, but by and large, it's the real deal here. We do get some stop motion animation here. The one thing I will say about the Universal edit, I do like the fact that they added a more audible scream to this native during this segment. I will say that is one of the few things that edit did better. And we're approaching 40 minutes into the film, and we're going to be getting Kong showing up. Both kaiju show up relatively early in the film. Godzilla showed up, probably about 25 or so minutes into the film. Now, roughly 10 minutes later, we're getting Kong. Even though this version of the film is nearly 10 minutes longer than the American cut, it still doesn't take long for the kaiju to show up. I've always still wondered how she got out with her son Skeeto, I think is what her son's name is, because it seems like they come out from underneath the octopus, and I'm just always thinking that there didn't appear to be a gap or anything like that, and she came out running, standing up. I always thought that was um, just really odd how that was pulled off. And here's Kong. The gate is nearly as tall as he is, but maybe a tad shorter. Obviously, still borrowing references from that original 33 film. Again, a film and a character that helped to inspire Godzilla. Toho and Tanaka were obviously very thrilled to have a chance to get a shot at doing a Kong film. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they had the license for King Kong for about 5 years. And for whatever reason, other than King Kong Escapes, they never were able to produce any other Kong films. And it's sort of funny because Japanese audiences fell in love with King Kong when it was released in Japan. Um, I believe it was in 53 that that film was released in Japanese theaters. It was wildly popular, and Tanaka looked at Kong and also the Rhedosaurus from Beast from 20,000 Fathoms as inspirations for creating Godzilla. And here they have the license to the character for 5 years, and all they produced were two movies. It's kind of crazy. Can you imagine, though, what kind of films we could have gotten? I mean, this is sort of a goofy film, and then you have King Kong Escapes, which was also co produced with Rankin Bass. And Rankin Bass would go on to produce an animated cartoon series around the same time as King Kong Escapes. And both times you have Kong suits that are really just rough, to say the least. The King Kong Escape suit, however, I will say is definitely an improvement over this. But that suit, where it fails utterly, is when that suit is in the water. When that suit is in the water, it's almost as if someone was wearing a sweatshirt. It becomes so soaked that it begins to adhere to Nakajima's body in that film. And the head prop, obviously, it begins to look bigger and wider than the rest of the body. I mean, it looks terrible in that moment when Nakajima, wearing the Kong suit, is in the water. Here, the biggest sins of the Kong suit are in the headpiece. It's still a halfway decent attempt for what they tried to do, but it's very obvious that for whatever reason they couldn't sculpt a halfway decent face and one that moved. Um, the pectoral regions of Kong are very apparent and have always looked a bit strange too. Their elongated arms sleeves, which are being worn right now by the suit actor, and um, it's just a weird representation of Kong. It's in terms of the effects department, that's probably the lowest aspect of this film is that Kong suit. While this chant to Kong, I think, is beautifully done, I find this segment to go on longer than what is really necessary. There could have been other means of moving the story along or trying to find a way to cut and transition further that would have made more sense. And instead, they decided, look, we paid all these people, which I'm assuming are professional dancers, to come in, so we're going to have them earn their paycheck by performing a dance segment here. Obviously, the better dance moves, because it seems like everyone else. You take a look at some of the women in the other shots during this dance. It almost seems as if they are half asleep as they perform the dance. Some of them they're just not into it, or they didn't want to be there. It's You get a couple of girls here. Yeah, a couple of girls there were a little off the mark in terms of choreography. I know I was talking an awful lot about the inception of the film and some of the production and some of the ideas that went into creating this film, and never really touched upon many of the major scenes at the beginning of this film that were cut from the American edit. And those scenes, obviously, we can't go back and rewind now, but a lot of those scenes did provide a lot of context to the story that was very much missing in the Universal cut. It adds more context and motives to our characters. Here's another one that was excised from the American cut. Talk of commercialism and ratings wars and all that more or less is implied here by Mr. Taco. Already see here saying, idiot, it's not a wrestling match. We're already getting people talking about it as a wrestling match. King Kong versus Godzilla. A film that is pretty self aware, which good for it. I give it props for that. They knew exactly what they were making. And of course, with a comedy, in some sense, depending upon the kind of story you're wanting to tell, you kind of have to be self aware in some cases. I know we talked about it a few months ago when we did the American commentary of this film, but I still just have to say it that regardless of the fact that that version is in nearly every way inferior to this film, I will say the dubbing in that film is superb. It is one of the better dubbed Godzilla films of the franchise for sure. And because, of course, I grew up with that version, I have watched that version significantly more than this one. There are moments where some of the dubbing dialogue comes through in my head as I watch this. Because I use Pacific drugs. There you go again, capitalism and marketing. Because I got King Kong, he's going to sell my drugs, and that's going to give me a leg up on the competition. Nothing much has changed in like about 50 years. This is kind of a segment where it brings in sort of that stereotypical hero versus monster type tale in. Um, because Fumiko Mihama and Kenji Sahara's characters, uh, they're all going to be kind of getting themselves in situations in which Sahara is going to have to try to get his girlfriend out. In fact, poor Fumiko is going to be involved in not confrontations, but moments with Godzilla and Kong. Can you imagine having being involved with with both of them at various points in their appearances on the mainland? But but yeah, that's. I will say too, with the Japanese edit of the film, it's not jarring in terms of those transitions from these comedic moments to those slightly more serious moments, but it's noticeable enough that I don't know how else you could have done it in terms of editing, but again, the word jarring keeps coming up, but it's not jarring. It's just, I guess, a little careless, I guess. We do get a lot of wonderful miniature work in this film. Subarai and his crew did a masterful job with this. Another disappointing aspect, however, with this film is the fact that very little real estate is not only destroyed in this film, but other than that beautiful castle that is destroyed at the end by both Godzilla and King Kong, we never get these two kaiju together in an urban setting duking it out. And that is one of the things that I'm so happy the latest Godzilla vs. Kong film fixed. Um, because this film was given a pretty decent budget. And for whatever reason, they never filmed even one fight of Godzilla and Kong in an urban setting where a bunch of miniatures were destroyed. They missed a wonderful opportunity to create a little bit more spectacle. And instead, we are treated to a semi entertaining bout, albeit quick, between the two in their initial meeting, where Godzilla literally has the high ground over Kong and they sort of toss a boulder. It's sort of silly, but nevertheless, this setting is beautifully done. The final battle, however, is just bland. It's almost as if they are literally playing on a set that is filled with dirt and sand. Very little of the setting is even crafted to try to look mildly interesting. And I will say that is the biggest disappointment is not only do you not have an urban battle between these two even once during the film, that final battle is, in terms of its setting, is absolutely dull. It's dull to look at. It's not interesting. Environments in these kaiju films tend to sometimes play a role in the spectacle. And I understand that, especially as you get into the late 60s and even more so in the 70s, mostly rural landscapes were used for the kaiju battles, and that's because it helped them save lots of money on having to build sets and other practical effects. And a lot of times, too, like for example with Godzilla vs. Megalon, not only did you have a small budget there, but you had a very short shooting schedule. Godzilla vs. Megalon, from pre production to about the time the thing was released, was all done in 28 days, just inside of a month. And as you can imagine, that's going to put a lot of stress and pressure on everybody involved to turn out the film on time. And it's just kind of unfortunate that you have a lot of films from the late 60s and more so in the 70s that are in rural settings. Um, It reminds me too of some of the tokusatsu TV shows I have seen thus far, such as Red Baron, um, a couple of the earlier Ultraman series. What's the other one? Iron King. A lot of the battles that are being held in those shows are also by and large in rural settings. Red Baron comes to mind to me more than most of the other shows that at this point I have seen during that time period, because with the exception of maybe a couple of moments in a couple episodes, or maybe even one or two episodes altogether, every single battle by and large is in kind of this barren desert looking setting. The battles are still fun because it's with these robots and it's something different than giant monsters, but they're still kind of dull to look at because it's, who doesn't want to see buildings blow up and collapse and maybe play a bit of a hand in the outcome of a battle? I mean, it's part of the charm of these types of films. You want to see real estate not just get destroyed, but you want to see real estate get destroyed in the tussle between the monsters. Here we go. Fumiko is having her brush with Godzilla. Very debatable as far as whether or not Godzilla actually sees her, but who knows? It's never made clear as to whether or not he does see her. Kenji Sahara always plays these parts very well. I mean, even in a film that's supposedly a comedy, he still pulls off, the frightened look well, and the tension. And again, too, this sort of tonally collides with the comedic aspect of the film. This is definitely a more serious segment. That is a bit of a problem with this film. Again, it's not overly jarring, but it's noticeable enough that it just doesn't seem like it all comes together cohesively. I find it strange, though, that even though the self defense force and the government basically said that he can't bring Kong, it's never indicated or implied even that they are trying to return Kong. It still seems as if they are making their way to Japan. And if that's the case, I almost seem to believe Mr. Taco should be arrested, quite honestly, for this. And I find it strange to begin with, anyways, that that destroyer, along with its captain and crew, more or less didn't escort that ship back to Faro Island to dump Kong back off there. I think to me, that's another issue I have with this um, segment of the story, in that, if they're not supposed to bring Kong, and it's never indicated that he needs to be returned, but yet he can't bring him in, and yet they still seem to be heading towards Japan. Why didn't they stay and escort Taco and his crew back to Faro Island to dump off King Kong there, and all that, to make sure that he followed through? Again, there's some moments during this segment in the Universal edit where Mr. Taco's dubber uh, brings in some no, don't shoot, don't fire, that I think are sadly missing in this edit. We had a few moments of that with Fumiko as she was trying to escape the train as well, where her dubber would occasionally let out a couple of screams that I thought helped add to some of the tension and just to the moment as well. And this particular Kong suit, when it's wet, actually doesn't look that bad. Whereas in the 67 film, oh man, it's terrible. Lincoln has now joined me in this commentary. He's never seen this version of the film either. I've seen this one about five to six times, and I will say that despite some of the issues I have with the story and a couple other aspects of the film, not only do I find it, obviously, as I've stated, I think a couple of times already, to be superior to the American edit, it's still a pretty decent film. And I think overall, regardless of whether I'm talking about the Universal edit of the film or even the original cut of this film that we're watching right now, this movie I do enjoy, but if I were to arrange the Godzilla films in a list from favorite to least favorite, for me this probably would hang somewhere probably more to the middle of the pack. Um, as I stated earlier, when I watched the American edit of this film as a kid, I did enjoy the film, but I was ever so slightly disappointed and underwhelmed that there wasn't more spectacle involved between the two monsters. And then having first seen this edit of the film 10, 11 years ago, I enjoyed it quite a bit more because you get a lot more of those missing scenes. You get more context to the story and characters and their motivations. I enjoy this a heck of a lot more. It's a more coherent, cohesive story than what you get out of the Universal film. But even then, because it is played as a comedy and because of just other areas of the film in terms of its story, some of which I've already mentioned as we approach just slightly over an hour at this point in the movie, that sort of drop it a tad more on the list for me. The Kong suit, I hate to admit it, is one of those things where, with it being not quite as expressive, uh, even though I know the Godzilla suit is not as expressive either, and we're approaching our first confrontation between the two titans here in just a second. And here's a moment at comedy that really I think is pretty ridiculous and quite dumb because it adds nothing. Um, the Kong suit really just doesn't sit well with me, and I know it doesn't with a lot of other fans in the United States. But it's interesting how, at least in my opinion, I always thought it was a tad funny that a suit on some level would influence on some level how much I liked or disliked a film. Um, and the Kong suit definitely has some of that. And just, I think the confrontation between these two, it is occasionally played for laughs. Even a tad more so in the Japanese cut here because they are more represented as anthropomorphic entities and as wrestlers a bit more than they are in the Universal cut. But it's still fun to watch, don't get me wrong, but I was still hoping for something more grand when you have the two biggest monsters of all time duking it out. Um, but yeah, it's a film that I would say on my list of going from favorite to least favorite, it would probably be somewhere in the middle. It's a film I don't watch too terribly often in either version. But it's one that I probably tend to watch once every, I don't know, on average year, year and a half. And I know I talked about the Kong suit a couple of times here, but I never mentioned the Godzilla suit. Godzilla obviously got a facelift for this film, and arguably out of the first three films, this is the best looking Godzilla suit so far, and I really enjoy it. It's been one of my favorite designs. Um, it definitely looks more like a dinosaur here. The suit, yeah, is a tad bit bulkier, and as we just saw just a second ago, when Haru Nakajima inside the suit kind of, bends a little bit, you see kind of the bagginess of the suit, but it's not too bad. And it's a beautiful looking suit. The only thing I dislike about it is when you look at the suit head on, the head seems to look a little too wide. It's almost as if it's slightly misshapen, and that's the only real complaint I have, and more or less it's a nitpick at this point. But it's one of my favorite Godzilla suits, and my understanding too is this particular iteration of the King Goji suit is very popular with fans here in the States as well. The Masugoji suit, which would follow in the next film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, seems to be a huge fan favorite. For a number of years after I first saw that film in 1994, as a what 9 year old, no 9 year old at that time, um, I wasn't a fan of. In fact, at the time, I really disliked that suit. I hated the fact that the jowls were loose, even though I would later find out that that was something that the special effects department tried to fix but was unsuccessful after numerous attempts. But after many watchings, because that is indeed one of my all time favorite Godzilla films, and I've watched that film I don't know how many times, I've grown to enjoy that suit. That suit, of course, though, contours to Mr. Nakajima's body more so than the suit here and in the first two Godzilla movies. But I would say, though, in my personal opinion, this King Goji suit is hands down one of the better looking suits out of the entire Showa era, and I would probably even argue the best looking suit out of the entire Showa era. It definitely looks more dinosaurian, and I just think it's a better representation of the creature. Whereas definitely after this film and going forward up until you reach the Heisei era, all the suits began to contour more to the suit actors than anything else, instead of trying to make something that at the time was considered paleontologically accurate. This right here, buddy, is the Japanese version of the film. It has many of the scenes that are missing from the US edit. Yeah, I gave it to you the other day. Yeah, I just gave my son my NECA 1962 King Goji toy here the other day. I figured since I have already a smaller version of that toy from, gosh, what was that set? It came out when Godzilla 2000 came out back in '99 and 2000. Memorial, not the memorial set. Oh, I forget the name of it, but it came with 5 different Godzillas, and the '62 Godzilla was one of those that came with it. So I figured, you know what? As much as I love the '62 Godzilla and I love that figure, it was literally just sitting in my closet. I didn't have it on display or anything else. I do love that version, as I've stated several times. But I just figured, you know what, my son, 6 year old, I remember being a 6 year old enthralled with dinosaurs and all that. I wasn't a Godzilla fan yet, wouldn't see my first Godzilla movie for a couple more years. Um, I would enjoy something like that and it would get more use. And so he's returned with his King Goji toy. The interesting thing is that the head on appearance of Godzilla in the close ups really is not as bad as they are from further away, which is strange. It's interesting too how in the Universal edit this sequence here is edited as if they were listening to the radio, which I will say is pretty ingenious how they cut all that together. Again, you can criticize that edit all you want. They did some interesting things with it. And we do get a fair amount of kaiju action in this movie, despite the fact that sadly little real estate is destroyed. Just the fact of seeing the giant monsters on screen is a joy. We got some cars running in the foreground there. That's a nice touch. Apparently, 1 million volts of electricity is all that Godzilla can handle. It's not that easy for him, bud. Because they had wires all the way down. He couldn't easily duck like that. Yeah, Godzilla could have set fire to the electrical towers and that probably would have taken care of it, but for whatever reason, Honda and crew didn't want that to happen. So, yeah, that is sort of a misstep. And then here we have another moment within the story that a lot of American fans, myself included, think is one of the goofier elements of this movie, and it really is sort of an admittance by filmmakers that King Kong by himself, most likely, at least in this iteration, could not defeat Godzilla. And so the only way he's going to stand a chance is that he's somehow going to be able to tolerate electricity. And not only tolerate it, but grow stronger from it and eventually emit it from his hands as he's fighting Godzilla. So, again, I know this is a comedy, and I'm almost certain that on some level, the introduction and addition of such abilities to King Kong not only was maybe played for comedic, but I think probably a tad bit more for trying to even the playing field, so to speak. Um, Even though it is one of the more ridiculous moments, I think of the franchise, and this is something that and I know many other fans bring up as something that, even though it's a movie about giant monsters, one of the things that tends to really bug us about this film is the fact that King Kong is able to tolerate and emit electricity. Go figure. It's always the small stuff that we sweat. Some maybe. Here we get a nice, good looking set here, but an obvious Kong puppet in the background. Wonderful sets, and again here too, they built these decent sized sets. It's a little strange that they didn't take advantage. They knew that this stuff was going to have to be tore down anyways. Why didn't they take advantage of these two titans going at it and destroying some of these miniatures? It would, I think, improve the enjoyment of this film. Not that it's not enjoyable, but I think it would make it even more enjoyable. This film, I think, would arguably be in a lot of people's top 10, maybe even top 5, had they included something like that here. I always thought Kong looked pretty goofy here when he had those up close shots looking down at Famiko. This scene would be mimicked to some extent a number of years later. What about 22 years later in The Return of Godzilla, when Godzilla in that movie picks up a train car and looks through it at one point. You've seen it. We get a great miniature here of the Dia building soon, in which will be scaled by Kong. It's amazing how incredibly tough and sturdy that miniature had to be in order for the actor to scale it and not have it break. I always thought this was kind of a silly moment by Kenji Sahara, throwing his hands up in the air. Fumiko! Fumiko! I know it's not supposed to be played for laughs, but that's kind of the problem sometimes with some of these comedy films that try to be dramatic at the same time. Sometimes the line gets blurred. You just don't know how to take it. Now, granted, maybe to a Japanese audience it becomes very obvious and apparent, but, you know, just even the way it looks, regardless, it kind of comes off as comedic to me. Once again, Mr. Taco talking about profits, saying it's a total loss if Kong dies. More concerned about his bottom line and his drugs than he is about saving people. It's kind of interesting that Sakurai's office must not be that far from the diet building in which he's able to get his drum set. A segment that I think is pretty smart, but at the same time, I think lazily and contrivantly put together, in that they're able to quickly not just get his drum set, but to load bombs loaded with the soma berry juice. Um, it's too convenient, too contrived, and the scene itself, especially once the drumming gets started, goes on too long. I don't have a problem with what they're doing at this moment. It's when they start doing the banging of the drums and you start hearing native chants, and that song that again, that's where I think it plays on too long. And it just seemed like we had that native chant on Faro Island, but by this point, that was what, about 45 minutes ago, oddly enough, at this point. Channeling the natives. And I like the fact too in the Universal edit they added some sound effects, in which there were none, and I think that helped add to it. Such as when Kong was sliding down the side of the Diet building there just a moment ago. Not the one where he just crashed here, but just prior to that, they added sort of a kind of a rustling sound as he slid down. I thought that's just a nice touch, and that's something that occasionally I think becomes a plus for some of the American edits of some of the films. I've stated on our podcast several times that while I do think The Return of Godzilla, the Japanese cut, is a vastly superior film, and I would argue probably one, if not the best Godzilla films ever made, there are moments from a music and sound effects standpoint that I thought the American edit just did a better job of adding those things in where I thought it was necessary. What about letting them fight again? Let them fight. Heroes cannot coexist. Is he implying that Godzilla in some way is a hero? And another thing, and I don't know if it was necessarily being played for laughs, but uh, Kazuo's string that is stronger than, or wire, excuse me, that is stronger than steel. An interesting idea, but come on. I mean, for as thin as it is, give me a break. And then on top of that, the fact that they use it to transport Kong is silly in and of itself. And again, I don't know if that was necessarily played for laughs, but it comes off just as silly and ridiculous as this movie tends to be at points. Some decently animated soldiers on top of Kong, even though it's obvious animation, at least they tried, so. Kind of a neat shot of the set there. They're a tad bit bigger than the helicopter there, but oh well. I've always wondered how they were able to get the wire underneath Kong while he was lying down. That's, there's a little something that wasn't explained. It's Mount Fuji. It just hasn't erupted in a very long time. Here we are getting ready for the final battle. It's amazing with Kong's movement how that just doesn't somehow affect the helicopters. I would think that would be enough to bring the helicopters close together and crash them. And see, even Lincoln said it was funny, hence comedy. And this particular set piece right here is probably about the best set piece other than the castle right at the end that we're going to get during this final battle. And I like the fact, too, that Haru Nakajima added the idiosyncrasy of Godzilla clacking his forelimbs together. That was a nice touch, but sadly, it's something that's never continued in subsequent films. You think so? Kinda does make him look like he's more happy. always thought that was funny. He throws it, he just goes so far, he tumbles down. And an only brief second and a half or so moment where there's armatures being used for a stop motion segment. He keeps getting smacked in the head. You'd think he'd have a terrible concussion. And by sheer coincidence, a lightning storm is entering the area. What a coincidence. His face glows. Again, basically, Kong was all beat here, and then had to incorporate this cockamamie idea into the film. Because Kong's struck by lightning, and he's able to emit electricity in this movie. Mm-hmm. You get a few miniatures here, but they're so small and there's not enough of them. And in general, it's not in an urban setting enough to really, increase the spectacle that much. If at all, quite honestly. This road's closed, but you can go ahead and walk down that hill. This always looked a bit silly to me, too. Two obvious hand puppets going at it. The movement, it doesn't seem as if they're trying too hard in a couple of those moments there to make it seem as if they're tussling in any realistic, logical way. That I almost do wonder if Nakajima actually did lose a little bit of his footing as he was going down that hill there. And obviously, probably the biggest and most masterful set piece of the entire film right here. Makes absolutely no sense as to why they would be doing this, why they would be on opposite ends trying to dig through it and do it, other than just the fact that it looks cool. And there they go, tumbling down. It's kind of funny how, with some of these movies, that the more you watch them, it seems that some of these battles are a lot shorter than they were when you first saw them. I remember as a kid when I first saw this movie, the first, I don't know, odd number of times, it seemed as if this was a decently long battle, and anymore when I watch it, regardless of which version, it doesn't seem like it lasts that long. It seems like it's a 5 minute tussle, and I think it's maybe what, like a 10-12 minute tussle, which is still decent, but it just seems a lot shorter than that. And there goes Kong. He was able to hold his breath enough. How to adapt ourselves to our surroundings. That was not even a theme in this film. And unlike the ending to the American edit, where all you hear is Kong's roar, you're going to get both Kong and Godzilla's roar here at the end. So Godzilla is not dead. And that is the end of the Japanese edition, or cut, I should say, of King Kong versus Godzilla here. So, Japanese version of King Kong versus Godzilla. So, what do you guys think? I know for a lot of you, this was when you purchased this Criterion set, this was the first time in which you were able to finally see this edition of the film. And I understand from what I've seen on various groups and pages on social media that having that film available alone in the Criterion set was reason enough for you to drop the decent chunk of money it took to purchase this set. Um, my opinions personally on this particular cut of the film is that, as I stated a few times over the course of the commentary, it is a superior film in just about every way to the American edit. The only times in which I believe the American edit is sort of superior in a way is when it adds or subtracts certain types of music and sound effects throughout the course of the film. And in the case of King Kong vs. Godzilla, in terms of sound effects, I think it's superior when it has added certain sound effects in certain scenes that this original edit didn't have, and also took away music at various points in which there was music being played in various scenes. Then again, though, too, I'm a tad biased. I grew up with that edition more than anything else. But even then, in terms of things like Fumiko screaming when she's in that river trying to escape Godzilla after he's attacking that train. That is missing from this edition, and after seeing or comparing it with the Universal edit, I think the Universal edit does a superior job in that particular moment in terms of capturing some of the horror and adding something that I think adds more impact to that scene. It's kind of hard, to talk about some of these films like Gojira and Godzilla King of the Monsters and King Kong versus Godzilla and the Universal cut of it without really comparing them because, these two films are so vastly different from one another. You can't kind of get away from that argument. But in my opinion, I still think it's a pretty darn good film. I think like I said, this film in general is still kind of a middle of the pack for me in terms of favorite to least favorite Godzilla films if I were to rank them. If I were to either exclude the Universal cut or simply kind of go by the best version of each film that I've seen in terms of my rankings, this would be maybe a tad higher just because the Japanese cut is better. Um, but it's not a bad film. I suggest people check it out if you haven't already. I'm not sure uh, in terms of the criterion set how much of readily available that is now at this point or not. Hopefully, most of you have been able to get your hands on a copy of that set so you can watch this version, especially if you are someone who has yet to see this. But it's a good film. I think if I would have to say, though, obviously, um, despite some of the shortcomings that I've had that I've mentioned over the course of the commentary, still a good film. And I still think if you're a Godzilla or Tokusatsu fan, this is obviously one in which you have to seek out and see because there is such a mythology, at the very least, just behind the history of this film in terms of not just how it came to be, but all the myths about when it came to the States here, how there was this myth for decades about there being two endings to this film when there aren't. And there are some differences, but there aren't two separate endings. And so it's something I think you have to watch. I think you should seek out, obviously, and I think it's worth owning. Again, it's the better one of the two. Um, Check it out. Hopefully, you all enjoyed this commentary. Hope you all will continue to enjoy our Daikaiju Fest here over the next few days. And we'll see you guys here in a few weeks when we resume our regularly scheduled podcasting. Take care, everybody.